Imagine a country where elections become an endless fight for survival, where every vote feels like the last hope for a better future. But in the end, winning the election is just the start of a more dangerous road. I'm talking about Venezuela, a country torn apart by economic crisis, political instability, and an authoritarian regime. In October 2023, events occurred that could have changed the country's history. The long-suppressed opposition finally held a primary election, and one of their key figures won with a staggering 92% of the vote. It seemed like the moment for change had arrived. But no. By March 2024, that leader was disqualified by the government. Another opposition figure, a literature and philosophy graduate, took her place and tried to continue the fight, but she too was stopped. Is this the government's strategy or fear of losing power? In July 2024, a new candidate emerged, another hope for the weary citizens. He won again, but once more the government refused to acknowledge the results. From the streets of Caracas, the cries of protests echo. People take to the streets, tearing down statues of Chavez and Maduro and burning portraits of former leaders. The country has been stuck in this political battleground for years. It's gotten so absurd that by September 2024, the new opposition leader had to flee to Spain to escape persecution. The situation keeps growing more unpredictable. Protests won't stop, and the repression only gets worse. There's no legitimate president, and the elections meant to bring hope have turned into an endless nightmare. I remember my trip to Venezuela in 2018, one of the most dangerous shootings of my life. What I saw back then seemed chaotic, but what's happening now is beyond imagination, and what lies ahead for this country, what everyone is wondering. Today we'll talk about what's happening in Venezuela. It's a story of how power can end up in the hands of those willing to sacrifice everything and everyone just to achieve their goals.
They were beating everyone with batons, throwing Molotov cocktails. It was a nightmare.
And here's how it ended: a burned out truck. Most of the crime frequently happens in these particular areas, including robberies, murders, and kidnappings.
I actually ended up getting hit by a rubber bullet during the incident.
They might shoot you without even asking who you are.
It was terrifying, honestly. That's when the intense real street fights suddenly broke out. Hey guys, what's up? This is Lyadov here with a brand new evening talk format. I'm just gonna sit here with you and have a chat over a nice cup of coffee. Maybe I'll even add a few delicious cookies once I've managed to lose a bit of weight. So I'll be sharing some interesting stories that happened to me. Today I'll talk about the most dangerous shoot I've ever done. It was in Venezuela during some serious protests. I think you could certainly call this the official start of my blog, because before that, I didn't really have a dedicated travel format. I was mostly doing interviews and working on a few other different projects. But when we ended up in Venezuela, things changed. Our video suddenly blew up and went viral. That's where the new format started, showing how people live. I'm still actively doing it even today. So today I'm really excited and eager to tell you all about one of the most incredibly dangerous shoots I've ever been on in my entire career. Let me start by talking about Venezuela. What happened to that country and what was going on with me at the time? Back then, I was working in television, and in 2019, Venezuela, well, it descended into complete chaos. The country, how do I put this, is extremely rich in oil. I mean, really rich. They've got more oil than Saudi Arabia.
There's significantly more oil here than in Saudi Arabia, which looks like this. More than in the United Arab Emirates, which looks like this. And by the way, even more than in Russia, though we'll skip the pictures here.
The country was driven into extreme poverty, basically into absolute destitution. Year after year, life there kept getting worse and worse. And all that time, the political regime stayed the same. First, the country was led by Chavez, and then Maduro came to power. This Maduro guy, you know, he was a hardcore socialist, kind of like Lukashenko. Although, to be honest, Lukashenko turned out to be even tougher than Maduro. Though, in my opinion, they could argue about that. But the point is, Maduro brought one of the richest oil nations in the world to such a terrible level of poverty that they faced a severe and prolonged food shortage crisis. This shortage persisted for several years.
In the city of Maracaibo, crowds were looting stores, grabbing whatever they could find. Here you can see women splitting up some defrosted sausages. With the fridges broken, people were willing to buy even spoiled meat.
Chaos was everywhere. The economy collapsed, dissidents were thrown in jail, while some others were also arrested, and some just mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Eventually, the chaos in Venezuela hit a breaking point, and a new leader emerged, a man named Juan Guaidó. You could definitely say he was kind of the primary opposition against Maduro's regime.
Juan Guaidó, the opposition leader, declared himself president. He wasn't just some random guy, he was the Speaker of Venezuela's parliament.
So Guaidó managed to unite a pretty progressive part of society. People who honestly were just fed up with Maduro, or more like fed up with him doing absolutely nothing. To give you some additional context, the guy used to be a bus driver. Now, I'm not saying bus drivers are bad people, not at all. That's definitely not the point I'm trying to convey here. But he was someone who just sat there riding on the fact that the country was sitting on massive oil reserves and he did absolutely nothing. And when oil prices crashed, everything quickly turned to chaos.
Tear gas is really brutal. It burns your skin. People were lighting stuff up and throwing it. They even set a truck on fire.
Guaidó started rallying the opposition, who also wanted Maduro out of power, and soon real street battles and violent clashes erupted across the country.
People were throwing either rocks or Molotov cocktails at each other and at the authorities.
It turned into full-on shootouts with Molotovs flying back and forth between the factions, the government forces and the determined opposition.
Then the military reinforcement showed up, a tank with a rotating turret. It could plow right through a crowd at any moment, crushing people and shooting tear gas in every direction.
And this is the precisely moment when I arrived in this country.
Behind me, you can see sneakers hanging by their laces from the power lines overhead. That's a well-known symbol indicating that this particular area is controlled by a local gang and they run everything around here with absolute authority. You don't just come here without serious caution. I'm not exaggerating at all. When we arrived, we were immediately told to stay in the car. Our guide went ahead, talked to the right people, and only then were we finally allowed in. That was absolutely the only way to get here.
At the time, Venezuela had one of the highest crime rates in the entire world. It was consistently ranked in the top for crime. So much so that when we got there, the Russian embassy explicitly told us, don't even think about leaving the airport on your own. It was so incredibly dangerous that we were told to wait for a car to pick us up. And sure enough, a bulletproof SUV eventually showed up and they drove us directly from the airport to the hotel. The hotel was one of the most expensive ones available, but its high price was mostly for the security it offered. Armed guards with automatic weapons were stationed all around the property. Safety was the top priority and they provided it at a very high level. The crime levels were such that you could easily get stopped at a traffic light. These gangs would frequently target unsuspecting people at stoplights or in traffic jams. At first, they'd just casually walk along between cars. And they'd rob the passengers. Of course, they were mostly after tourists because there wasn't much point in robbing the locals. Sure, they'd take stuff from the locals too, but they didn't have much. No expensive things, no money. And when they found tourists, they took everything. It got to the point where they'd even break someone's finger trying to take off a wedding ring. That's the kind of tense atmosphere we unexpectedly found ourselves in. We were immediately told right away, don't leave the hotel, just stay inside and only travel by car from one point to another. So absolutely no wandering around on your own. I was with my cameraman Azat, who had already been to some very dangerous places. One evening we were sitting there and the next day we thought, maybe we should try going out. We wanted to buy some water or something instead of paying $100 for a bottle at the hotel, so we decided to bravely walk to the store ourselves. We started cautiously, slowly exploring the streets of Caracas, trying to figure out which streets were safe and which ones we should be sure to avoid. You walk around and notice, okay, this street is pretty empty. You think maybe it's dangerous here, so it's better to take a completely different route. And we thought, the chance of getting robbed here is pretty high. Let's move to the next street. So we'd keep going until we found a street with more people and walk there. That's how we gradually started finding somewhat safer routes. Slowly, we got over our initial fear and began going out more frequently. And honestly, I don't regret taking that calculated risk. Because of it, we ended up seeing the places we truly wanted to explore. I ended up staying there for about a month in total. And every single time I saw something interesting happening around me, I'd immediately start filming it on my phone without hesitation. At the time, I didn't even think it could ever become some kind of documentary project in the future. I was recording different moments and as they happened. I had a friend back then, and he's still my friend to this day, Karim. Hello there, Karim. He was genuinely interested in what was happening in Venezuela. I even filmed some videos just for him, saying things like, "Look, there's this huge line of cars here," or something similar to that.
Where was that long line of cars headed? To the border, to get license plates, to a gas station, or for repairs?
I shot a couple of videos like that, and then I got hooked and started filming everything. After a while, I thought, why not try to make something bigger out of this? So after returning, I decided to write a script. It took me a long time to write it myself and then probably another month editing it. I love editing, so I downloaded Adobe Premiere and got to work. And well, this is the result we got.
The Venezuelan slums are referred to as barrio. While the word translates from Spanish as neighborhood, in reality, it signifies the poorest areas of the country. These barrios were constructed on the cheapest land available in Caracas, typically on hills and high ground. Even today, it remains the area where the poorest people continue to live.
Now about these colorful and striking favelas, it's honestly one of the most unique places you'll ever find. Going there without a guide? Not recommended. You can, sure, but the chances of getting robbed are pretty high. Or you just won't see anything worthwhile and you won't get to talk to the locals. If you start filming, people will immediately come up to you asking what you're doing and why. And you'll have to give them an answer on the spot. If you don't speak Spanish, specifically the kind of Spanish that they speak in Latin America with their particular accents and which is also very different from the standard Spanish spoken in Spain, they'll instantly recognize you as an outsider and not in a good way at all. Plus, all kinds of illegal stuff and contraband are openly sold there for anyone to see, making it a risky environment. If you show up with a camera, you immediately draw a significant amount of attention to yourself. There are lookouts who will spot you with a camera and might think you're some kind of undercover cop or government agent. It's extremely dangerous because at best they'll just take your camera away from you. And that's really the least that could possibly happen to you in these favelas, where the risks and potential threats are considerably higher.
If suddenly someone stops you and demands money or something else from you, you just silently raise your hands and give everything away. It's advisable, by the way, not to look them in the eyes, because their rule is this: if they realize that dealing with you will take a long time and be a hassle, and it's easier for them to just shoot you, they will simply do it, no regrets.
Let me provide you with some additional background on this madness that initially started there. As I've mentioned before, Venezuela is a country abundantly rich in oil resources with strong socialist leanings that have shaped its political landscape. This entire situation began with a charismatic leader named Hugo Chavez, who played a pivotal role in transforming the nation's trajectory. Chavez was a strong, charismatic leader. He had this way of talking that could captivate anyone. He was a true showman, an actor who knew how to grab attention. He was really impressive. He also skillfully positioned himself as the true and unwavering protector of the Venezuelan people. He'd often say, "Look, we're selling off all this valuable oil, but the ordinary people aren't seeing any of the benefits or improvements in their everyday lives." At some point, he reorganized the entire system so that the money from oil sales would be directed to various social programs. Everything seemed to be going well for a while, and people practically worshipped him for it. They even carried him on their shoulders. He became incredibly popular because he started spreading the wealth among the broader population. Naturally, that made him even more beloved by the people. But he never considered what would happen if the price of oil suddenly dropped unexpectedly. He got lucky because, during his lifetime, oil prices remained consistently high. However, after his death, when his successor Maduro came to power, a hardcore socialist, at least in name, oil prices plummeted dramatically. And when oil prices tanked dramatically under Maduro's leadership, everyone quickly realized that the country didn't actually have a functioning economy. Just to give you a clearer idea, despite having massive oil reserves, at the time I was there, the country didn't even have a single operational oil refinery. Can you even imagine that? These people had become so incredibly lazy and complacent that they figured, why bother investing time and resources into building oil refineries when we've got all this oil already? We can just sell it as it is and not do anything else at all. Basically, why change anything at all when you can just sell oil and make money? But when the price of oil drops significantly, it becomes clear that this strategy has some serious downsides and flaws. However, no one really knows what to do about it, and no one seems interested in figuring it out. The people still continue to support the government and just keep living as they always have. Then, quite suddenly, a leader named Guaido emerged in the country, backed by both the US and several European nations at that particular time.
More than 50 countries recognized Guaido, including the US president, Trump, and for over half a year, Venezuela essentially had two presidents.
The fact that the USA supported him, in my opinion now, at that moment did not do him any good, because the country, Venezuela, had been fed for many years with the idea that America is the enemy. Both Chavez and Maduro, they hated America. Well, more precisely, they said they hated America. Meanwhile, their kids were taking pictures with American pop stars. They went to study there and so on. You know, is the classic thing of politicians. They said one thing and did another, and it turned out that it became part of the national idea to hate capitalism.
At rallies, Maduro would ask the crowd, "Do you want to pay for electricity like they do in other countries?" And everyone would shout back, "No, of course not." He'd continue, "That's why we can't let these American puppets take power, bringing their damn capitalism."
Because capitalists tend to play by different rules, it becomes a lot easier to control people when you can say, "Look folks, I'm selling oil and providing you with free electricity." Back then, a considerable number of people in Venezuela didn't have to pay for electricity at all. "Don't you like that?" He'd ask them, and they'd enthusiastically answer, "Of course we do, but if those damned Americans come in, they'll impose their capitalist ideas, and you'll have to pay for electricity and for everything else. Is that what you really want?" They'd pointedly ask at the rallies, and of course the crowd would shout, "No!" So that was that. No Americans were allowed here, under any circumstances, period. For many years, the country was thoroughly soaked in this pervasive anti-capitalist sentiment. So when Guaido received support from the US, things didn't go well for him at all. However, at that particular time, he was the only leader who could even attempt to challenge and potentially shake Maduro's deeply entrenched regime. People started to unite in large numbers, taking to the streets for widespread protests, which the government cracked down on brutally and without hesitation. The crackdown was so harsh and severe that what happened later in Belarus after the elections could easily be compared to what was happening in Venezuela at that time. There were truly horrible, serious battles and violent confrontations going on throughout the country.
People were protesting, burning police cars, lighting tires on fire. In response, the military blocked off streets and dispersed opposition groups so they couldn't form into one big, uncontrollable mob.
At that point in time, there was no law and order in the country because no one was actively asking for it or enforcing it. All the security forces were focused solely and entirely on the task of keeping Maduro firmly in power. They were busy breaking up protests, guarding key state assets like vital oil wells and so on, without any regard for maintaining public safety. There was no point in investigating street crimes because the main goal of the authorities was entirely focused on maintaining power. As a result, the entire country was in a state of complete chaos, and it was truly terrifying for everyone, especially since all of this was happening against a backdrop of widespread mass poverty. In such dire conditions, there was absolutely no hope of finding whoever had robbed or injured you. For example, let me tell you a real story that our guide shared with us during our visit. He took a wounded man to the hospital, and it turned out to be an absolute nightmare. The line was seemingly endless, and there was filth everywhere. This was primarily because there weren't enough resources available to maintain even decent conditions in social and medical facilities. It got so absurdly ridiculous that doctors couldn't even write out necessary prescriptions because there wasn't any paper available at the hospital for them to use at all. Imagine that. It's not a joke. They couldn't find a single piece of paper in the entire hospital to write a prescription.
The hospitals were completely without power. During surgeries, doctors had to use their phone flashlights to see. Ventilators weren't working, so doctors were manually pumping air into patients' lungs.
This was one of the numerous consequences of the chaos under Maduro's rule. He'd run the country into the ground to such an extent that even paper factories had just given up entirely. And at some point, they completely stopped producing paper altogether, leaving the entire nation in an even more dire state than before.
People here even have to save on napkins.
Look at these napkins. Damn. They look like someone just cut up a newspaper. What even is this? Honestly, you can't even wipe your hands with those napkins. It reminds me of the old days in the Soviet Union when toilet paper was rough, but even that was better for your skin.
The country went through an incredibly severe paper crisis where even a single roll of toilet paper ended up costing half a month's salary for the average worker. I'm truly not exaggerating at all when I say this. It was shocking.
One roll of paper costs 21,000 bolivars, which is roughly equal to $7 or €6.34. But really, the comparison should be made with the local salary. With just one paycheck, you could only afford to buy a single roll. This highlights the extreme disparity between wages and the cost of basic necessities.
The same unfortunate thing happened with banknotes. When the entire country ran out of cash, the government simply said, let's just print more money to solve the problem. They printed it, then again, and just kept going. It felt like the printing press was running non-stop, constantly producing more and more banknotes. It seemed like all the paper in the entire country was being used just to print money. As a result, inflation reached truly absurd levels.
Inflation in Venezuela skyrocketed to astronomical levels. For example, last year it was 1,300,000%. It became easier to weigh money on a scale than to try and count it, highlighting the extreme nature of the crisis.
And imagine this scenario. The paper they used to print the bills on actually became more valuable than the face value of the bills themselves. This situation highlighted the severe economic issues the country was facing at the time.
It got to the point where the rectangular piece of paper used for printing was worth more than the amount printed on it. Printing money just wasn't worth it anymore.
Eventually, they realized they couldn't afford to print any more money. It had simply become too expensive. There weren't even enough resources available to make new bills. Due to rampant inflation, food prices soared to unbelievable heights, and people were forced to pay enormous sums for basic goods.
By the summer of 2018, a huge stack of cash could barely buy you one chicken. A slightly smaller pile would get you just a kilo of carrots, or even our beloved toilet paper, which had become a luxury item.
What is inflation? Let me explain it in simple terms. Imagine the country produces 100 kilos of potatoes, and each kilo costs $1. Then someone starts printing money without increasing the amount of potatoes. So you print, and keep on printing, and the more you print, the less each individual dollar is worth. But there aren't any more additional potatoes. In the end, as even more and more money is printed, you have to pay significantly more for the same kilo of potatoes. And as a result, the price steadily goes up. That's what we refer to as inflation. The same unfortunate thing happened with all goods. Their prices shot up to absolutely insane levels, leading to a terrible and widespread shortage of many essential products. I walked into various stores and honestly, there was almost nothing there at all to buy.
Here's a real store with empty shelves, old beat-up racks, and a rusty fridge holding nothing but empty bottles. People still collect and return those bottles just to make some money.
And if anything at all was on the shelves, it cost a ridiculous amount of money. For example, a bunch of bananas could cost as much as a quarter of a month's salary, just mind-blowing sums of money.
The only thing you can find in this store are green bananas, and the price is insane. Over $2 per kilogram, about a fifth of a monthly salary. It's hard to believe a kilogram of regular bananas costs so much.
That's what it was like.
Electricity disappeared in 22 of Venezuela's 23 states. From space, the country looked like this. Compare it not even to the US, but to neighboring Brazil or Colombia. Venezuela had no cell service at all.
Imagine this scenario. Electricity was unexpectedly cut in 22 out of the 23 states. I was completely shocked and taken aback because this was an entire country, not just some casual camping trip where you go rafting with friends, share stories, and have a few relaxing drinks. You're not in a sauna, you're in an entire country. There should be power plants, backup generators, and something in place for emergencies. However, nothing worked at all. Even cell service was down for several days. Really, the coverage was completely and utterly gone, leaving everyone disconnected and isolated. It's a living nightmare. So many things connected to electricity just stopped working. I remember at the hotel where we were staying, and mind you, it was one of the most expensive hotels in Caracas, chosen for safety. Everything stopped functioning. By the third or fourth day, they ran out of food. Seriously, because of the lack of electricity across the country. So you might ask, what does electricity have to do with food? Here's how it all connects. Food needs to be kept in refrigerators, which run on electricity. It also needs to be transported in trucks, which need to be refueled at gas stations that also run on electricity. All along the entire supply chain, ensuring everything functions smoothly. So when the power went out, everything came to a halt. It was absolute madness. Credit cards didn't work, ATMs didn't function, and nothing was operating. It completely blew my mind. That's one of the significant reasons why the progressive part of society became so upset and frustrated. Meanwhile, the less progressive part of society stayed largely indifferent, and I'll explain the reasons.
The main form of transportation in Venezuela's barrios is motorcycles. The streets are narrow and the houses are built as close together as possible.
What are these barrios, you might wonder? It was absolutely fascinating to see them when we visited, because they're basically their own unique world. People living there didn't bother to ask for any official permission to build. They simply went ahead and constructed their structures. They initially built their houses, and then their sons would add an extra floor on top of the existing structure, and then their sons would add yet another level. And that's how the whole of Venezuela gradually became covered in sprawling barrios over time. And in fact, it's very bad. Pretty much the same situation exists in all the Latin American countries I've been to. You'll find barrios in Colombia, in Brazil. Brazil has some of the most colorful barrios. They're in Uruguay and Argentina too. And that's just the ones I've seen with my own eyes. There are probably even more places like that than you can imagine. This is one of the key traits of warm climate countries. You see, in a place like Siberia, it's tough for someone to just build a house where they can live year-round. But over there, it's different. You can just throw together a house to protect yourself from the sun, the rain, and maybe thieves. And that's it. Your problems are mostly solved. And you need nothing more from your place for living. Life becomes much easier. There's a theory, perhaps you've encountered it before, that southern countries will inevitably struggle more than their northern counterparts. The reasoning behind this is that surviving up in the north requires a significantly greater amount of effort, resources, and resilience due to the harsher climate and challenging living conditions. Just look at the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Iceland, Sweden, and the rest. They're highly developed, reaching that point because to survive, not just thrive, they had to work hard. In harsh climates with limited resources, it took significant effort just to stay alive. But in the south, it's quite a different story altogether. You don't need to work nearly as hard to maintain a comfortable life. If you've got a basic shelter to protect you from the harsh sun, you're generally good to go. The main issue is to find food, and it's even easier there. It's another situation having to avoid freezing temperatures. That's why in many poorer southern countries, you see makeshift homes scattered everywhere you look. In Africa, for example, these makeshift homes are especially and quite remarkably common.
Traditionally, in urban environments, these areas are where most of the crime happens: robberies, assaults, murders, and occasional kidnappings.
Barrios are some of the most dangerous places. Why? Because it's incredibly hard to find and catch criminals there. In these favelas, which are built in the hills, it's super easy to hide. Tracking someone down takes a lot of effort. That's why you see a lot of illegal substances, weapons, and just about anything else you can imagine being sold there. Even the police, who are supposed to be there to fight crime and maintain order, are basically powerless. All the aggressive efforts to crack down on crime in the favelas at the time didn't make much of a significant difference. I remember another interesting case. In Brazil, we visited some fascinating favelas. We weren't just there to film. We were also meeting the main subject of my story. She had a young child who was seriously ill with a rare, life-threatening virus that caused a terrible and debilitating disease. We'd arranged to meet them somewhere in the busy city center. She invited us to her home to show how they lived and to talk about her daily life. We drove to her place, and I started to realize we were heading into a particularly dangerous and run-down area. She warned us, "Anton, there's no police presence there, just the locals keeping an eye on things." When we arrived, she said, "Stay in the car. I'll go talk to them, explain why you're here, and make sure they understand you're not here to film anything bad or controversial about them. I'll tell them you're just coming to my house, filming only me, and we'll stay in my apartment. If they agree, then you can come out." Then this guy walks out, just like a character straight out of a movie, wearing a sombrero like someone from Narcos or a dangerous cartel boss. He listened to her carefully without ever taking his eyes off her, and finally said, "All right, fine, but first, let them film me building this road for the whole town." So we ended up filming them working on the road with him. It was a typical situation in remote, lawless areas like this, where the local bosses run everything. People who've seized power, formed their own criminal gangs, and now ruthlessly control the entire region without opposition. And that's exactly how it was. Things really started heating up when Guaido began getting more and more people into the streets to overthrow Maduro. He gained widespread international support, humanitarian aid started pouring in, and various advisors, political analysts, and military specialists were being sent to assist and strategize for his movement. In general, Guaido had good intention. He wanted to, at the very least, get the country out of the chaos and madness it had unfortunately fallen into and restore stability. Maduro, on the other hand, was a seasoned player with extensive experience and knew precisely how to crush opposition at every level. Political protests were ruthlessly shut down by any means necessary, even through brutal and criminal methods. Maduro had his own enforcers, known as the colectivos, motorcycle gangs that handled situations with extreme violence and weren't afraid to do whatever it took, no matter how ruthless or unethical, to get the job done efficiently and maintain his tight grip on power. Their actions instilled fear and suppressed dissent across the nation.
The ones you really have to worry about are the masked guys on motorcycles. They'll shoot without even asking who you are. Those are the colectivos. We ran into them right near the border. 4 bikes with 2 men on each. They were just standing there waiting for their leader. Notice how regular people immediately freeze and step aside. The determined leader in a red shirt confidently leads the group toward the police. It seems tense at first, but the cops eventually let them through, and the bikers happily give a thumbs up in approval.
The mafia clans in Venezuela grew powerful for a very simple reason. The government needed their services and influence. At the time, the authorities relied heavily on them to get things done efficiently and quietly. They were necessary for the government to swiftly and effectively crush movements and protests that the official police couldn't handle, ensuring control over dissenting voices. So, all these colectivos were basically made up of people connected to the government in one way or another, receiving money or running protection rackets. They were like unofficial enforcers, not officially part of the government, but they handled things when someone needed to be taken care of.
The restrictions weren't just about how much you could buy, they also limited which days you were allowed to shop.
All the chaos and disorder meant that people simply couldn't buy food at normal prices. The government implemented a system of ration cards which provided citizens with a designated set of groceries. These groceries were only available for collection on a specific day of the week, and they could be redeemed exclusively at a particular store chosen for this purpose. It was totally normal to show up and find that half the items on your list were out of stock. Why was this happening? The issue persisted because even with the ration cards in place, the underlying problem remained unaddressed. Corruption infiltrated this initiative as well. It was common to encounter resellers positioned right next to the distribution centers, peddling the very same goods for 3 or 4 times the original price, often literally just across the street. And nobody cared. Nobody took any action to address the issue at hand. How did this situation come about? The answer was straightforward. Someone had connections or acquaintances who, in exchange for a favor or a bribe, would secretly funnel goods through the back doors of these distribution centers. These goods would then be sold at inflated, marked up prices. Naturally, there were always individuals ready and eager to purchase them. Because people were working 2, 3, even 4 jobs, exhausting themselves just to make enough money to buy something decent, give their kids some fruit, or afford a small luxury. It's complete madness because this is a perfect example of what happens when corruption gets this bad and remains unchecked over time. The result? Constant shortages of essential goods, severe economic instability, and widespread suffering for everyone. What shocked me the most wasn't the poverty itself, but how people came to accept it as normal. I saw the same thing in Cuba when I was there, a complete total shortage of everything, but people treated it as if it were just part of life. And it's this acceptance of poverty as normal that drives me crazy. It's based on people comparing their current lives to how things were before, like how their parents lived. For example, she says her father built this house with his own hands, and while they lived in tough conditions, she thinks things are better now. And that's natural because her father didn't even have a house at first. Even when they finally built one, they had no gas, no electricity, but now they do, and for her, that's just normal, you know? This low bar that people accept and take as normal becomes the new standard. Meanwhile, in the rest of the civilized world, technology is reaching unprecedented heights, and progress is accelerating forward at lightning speed, transforming industries and lives. You don't need to work 2 or 3 jobs, wearing yourself out just to feed your kids and keep a roof over their heads. I think this really highlights the situation in the country.
And these goods, if I understand correctly, are sold at controlled prices, right? So the prices are set.
Government price controls lead to goods vanishing as speculators buy them for resale.
The government gives out food at low prices, and that's why you can't find it anywhere, right? Speculators buy it all and sell it at marked up prices, and nobody cares. How are people supposed to survive? No one gives a damn. As long as there's a program on paper, that's all they care about. It's gotten to the point where in Venezuela, it's nearly impossible to get any kind of government service. Either you wait endlessly, standing in lines for 8 months, running from one place to another. It's a nightmare. It's just insane. When I look at all of this, I realize there's another country right now going through a very similar situation with even more obstacles and complexities. To get a basic government service like a passport, you can't simply show up and get it done. You have to find workarounds and make under-the-table deals. In Venezuela, they even sent me a detailed price list outlining the costs associated with enrolling your child in daycare, accessing various social benefits, or receiving care at a public hospital. It turns out that in order to obtain these so-called free services, you first need to pay a substantial bribe, often beyond what many can afford or are willing to give, further complicating access to essential services. Doesn't this remind you of anything?
A kilogram of sugar here costs about $1. For comparison, in our store, a kilogram of sugar costs around 45 cents. And if you want to buy pasta, you have to bring your own bag. And the price is the same, 90 cents per kilogram.
Yet, people still stand in long lines for these goods just to get something free. I saw the same situation in Cuba, where it's a similar story. The country is under a huge amount of sanctions, many of them unnecessary and overly harsh, imposed by the US. These sanctions have significantly impacted everyday life there, making things much harder. It's just crazy. I vividly remember walking down the street, and they brought in a shipment of sausages. Instantly, a massive line formed. The line stretched for about 30 or 40 meters.
People gathered there because at least there were some trees to provide shade. They stood for hours under those trees just to get a little relief from the heat.
Cuba is incredibly hot, yet people wait in line for hours without a single complaint. I remember asking my guide, "Do you think it's normal to stand for 2 hours in the blazing heat just for some sausages?" I was genuinely shocked at how patiently they waited despite the oppressive weather conditions, demonstrating remarkable endurance and resilience. But he was so used to it that he didn't even understand my question. He asked, "Well, how else would it be? What's the alternative?" I always do it this way. I go to work and think, okay, there's a store nearby that might get a delivery of oil. If there's no oil in this store, I'll go to the next one 2 blocks away. After that, then I'll stop by a third store, get in line for yogurt and ask for it. At the fourth store, where I know people well and have a good rapport, I can say I'm holding a place for someone I know personally and trust to arrive soon. And that's how he spends his day, going around collecting these unique products from various places. Yeah, you can find them, but only by doing it this way. I asked him, "Do you think that's normal?" And he replied, "Anton, are you an idiot? Of course you have to stand in line if they've got sausages." So we joined the line because he really needed those sausages, and he was happy to get them. And I realized he didn't understand my question because he doesn't know there could be another way. Sure, he's been to Italy or some other country, seen a different way of life, but that was only once, and it was a long time ago. He knows that theoretically things could be different, and he's not dumb, he gets that. And the other people probably understand that too. But it's like they don't allow themselves to believe that they truly deserve not to wait 2 hours for sausages. I try to understand why they think it's normal to wait in line for sausages or to drive around endlessly searching for groceries. The same situation applies to car parts. You often have to search the entire city for them. In Cuba, it's basically impossible to buy a decent car that you won't have to fix every week. Sure, you can buy a car, but it's going to cost a fortune. Cars in Cuba are actually more expensive than apartments. And each week, you find yourself diligently repairing it, persistently searching for the necessary parts. The situation escalates to the extent that individuals start to salvage components from boats or other motorized watercraft, repurposing them for use in their cars. This is how they manage to keep their vehicles operational. I genuinely tried to understand why he thought this was normal. I asked him, "Man, is this really normal?" And he looked at me like I was an idiot and said, "Anton, what's the big deal? Just stand in line and wait." And to me, it's simply beyond my understanding. Individuals are compelled to sacrifice their time, their health, and endure this peculiar sense of resignation that seems to have lingered from the Soviet era. That's the one aspect I find most unbearable about the Soviet Union, this pervasive feeling that one must simply accept the status quo without question or resistance. I understand that many of my viewers have a deep appreciation for the Soviet era, and I can see why, considering the various historical periods within that era. However, at this moment, I'm focusing on the shift in people's mindset that appears to lower their expectations, leading them to accept conditions or standards that could and should be improved. Honestly, who cares if there's an abundance of food available in America or Italy? That's not our concern. We believe that our focus should be on appreciating the fact that we're not subjected to capitalists charging us for essential services like electricity. It's that kind of mindset that really drives me up the wall.
At this very moment, I find myself situated on the boundary separating Venezuela from Colombia. I am still within Venezuelan territory, but Colombia is merely a kilometer away. The bridge linking the two nations has been completely blocked by the Venezuelan authorities, and the blockade is quite severe.
The most intense and dramatic event in Venezuela occurred when we traveled to the border with Colombia. Why did this critical and pivotal moment take place there? Because that location was the site of the most vigorous and determined resistance. Guaido, who was actively seeking to depose Maduro, had carefully orchestrated a plan to deliver essential humanitarian aid by way of multiple trucks coming from Colombia across the border. These countries share a common border, making it the most straightforward route for delivering the aid. Furthermore, Colombia is a close ally of the United States and collaborates closely with them on various issues. Consequently, all the European nations directed their aid, consisting of rice food supplies, blankets, socks, clothing, and other essential items, to Colombia. The aid was meticulously packed and loaded onto trucks, and Juan Guaido expressed his desire to spearhead the operation to transport the aid into Venezuela. For Guaido, it was a strategic political move aimed at boosting his popularity and credibility while simultaneously weakening Maduro's support and undermining his position. Consider the situation. The president has driven the country into such a severe crisis that it now requires urgent foreign humanitarian aid, despite there being no natural disaster or war to justify it. That's what happened. Maduro did everything in his power to stop those trucks, relentlessly blocking aid. He was determined that not a single grain of rice, not one blanket, nothing from that imperialist humanitarian aid was going to enter the country, and that's when things got really ugly. On the Colombian side were Guaido's supporters, while on the Venezuelan side there were people that Maduro had brought in, including activists, political figures, journalists, and security forces, all transported by buses to the area. Tensions escalated quickly, leading to a clash that turned violent and intense, with chaos erupting as both sides aggressively confronted each other, resulting in a chaotic and dramatic confrontation.
You can still see the remains of Molotov cocktails here. For example, here's the neck of a bottle that was lit and thrown. This is how it all ended, a burned out truck. Everything burned down to ashes. Honestly, I'd never seen a completely destroyed and burned truck before, so it made a lasting and significant impact on me.
This is what the bridges from Colombia into Venezuela looked like, completely blocked on Maduro's orders. They placed containers, large obstacles, military equipment, and all sorts of barricades to ensure that no vehicles or people could get through safely.
Here, you first notice the metal barriers that have been installed. Just behind me, you can observe a series of concrete blocks. Further beyond that, there are large, overturned trucks, which have been welded to the bridge's rails. Every one of these measures has been implemented to prevent any unauthorized entry from the Colombian side.
It was really tough to get here. We had to find a guide who was willing to come with us because the towns are full of gangs and thugs, and we needed to carefully explain who we were and why we'd come, which made it significantly more difficult. There was this incredibly fascinating Venezuelan guy who agreed to join us, but he communicated solely in Spanish. And at that time, I was completely unfamiliar with the language, not even knowing how to say hello or thank you, which made our interactions quite challenging. My cameraman was in the same boat. Our guide didn't speak a word of English or Russian, making communication difficult. We spent a whole week desperately trying to communicate without a common language. It was both hilarious and incredibly tough at times, but somehow, against all odds, we managed to understand each other. And whenever he came across anyone who spoke Spanish, whether it was a cleaner, a porter, or someone working in a cafe like the cook, he would immediately strike up a conversation and start chatting nonstop. We even gave him the nickname Radio because he just wouldn't stop talking, going on and on without pause. But I got him. He had that true Latin American soul, and he just needed to let it out. They're all super expressive and emotional, and he was no exception. I love that vibrant Latin American vibe, and it's so full of energy and life.
Here's an example of a typical situation. We're in a regular taxi, and the military blocked the road. The locals started getting upset because the road was closed.
Things started getting intense way before we even reached the border, as a large number of opposition supporters from Venezuela were heading there to support Guaido and create a dramatic scene, which escalated tension significantly. The military's job was to stop people from reaching the border. At the time, I didn't fully understand the gravity of it yet. And then this crazy thing happened. Our taxi driver, without warning or explanation, drove us straight into a heavily guarded military checkpoint, where the soldiers seemed very tense and on high alert.
I get out of the car, pull out my phone, and then bam! One of the soldiers didn't like that I was filming and decided to take my phone.
They started throwing tear gas canisters, and I'm filming it all. They were using excessive force against the protesters, and I was capturing it, not scared at all. At that moment, one of the soldiers hit my hand, and I quickly shoved my phone in my pocket, but he tried to grab it again. Chaos broke out. I'm desperately trying to get back in the car, and they're still trying to snatch my phone. It was just utter madness.
Azat, my cameraman, grabbed the bag and ran outside. Tear gas causes intense eye burning and makes breathing difficult in about 15 seconds. If the police advance with batons, you have 15 seconds to find shelter, whether in a ditch or around a corner, to avoid being trampled, as visibility will soon be lost. In the midst of the chaos, the worst possible scenario unfolded. Our taxi driver suddenly sped off with my bag, containing my passport, laptop with all the crucial footage, money, and important cards.
But then he came back and returned it all. Man, I was so relieved. Honestly, Latin Americans are just such good people, kind and helpful.
The situation on the Venezuelan border is incredibly tense across all areas, towns and villages. The tension just never goes away.
Under the relentless heat, my skin began to sear, especially considering my fair complexion. Sweat poured from every pore, and when they unleash the tear gas, it's not merely a matter of sprinkling a bit of pepper into your eyes and nose. It feels as they're rubbing it hard with every ounce of their strength. The pain is excruciating, like a searing burn spreading from the core of your being outward. Like, oh gosh, your skin begins to scorch as well, with your neck turning a vivid inflamed red beneath the blazing sun. It becomes intolerable. I've encountered tear gas in France, China, and Russia, but none of those experiences compared to the severity of this one. No doubt it's the fiercest one. It felt as it was specifically designed to inflict the greatest possible agony.
But the worst part? The slingshots. They shoot glass marbles with them. I saw a dent on a soldier's helmet from one of those shots.
These marbles are seriously dangerous. As you walk, you can hear them whizzing by rapidly, slicing sharply through the air. They may be glass, but they're incredibly fast and dangerous. If one hits you in the eye, you could easily lose your sight or suffer severe injury, requiring immediate medical attention. That was probably the most dangerous thing I've ever faced. But honestly, it wasn't as bad as rubber bullets. Once, I got hit by a rubber bullet right here on my arm, and it left a painful bruise for weeks. Yeah, seriously. It was during the Yellow Vest protests in France. I was walking and filming when things got really chaotic. At first, I didn't even realize it was a rubber bullet. I was walking, recording something on my phone when suddenly I heard a crowd rushing up behind me, people shouting loudly, and chaos unfolding around me. Then, all of a sudden, it felt like someone dropped a heavy brick on me. My whole body just went numb from the hit. Bam! Turned out it was a rubber bullet, which they call a scare round in situations like this. Yeah, it wasn't fun at all. It felt like getting hit with something really heavy, like half a brick. I had a helmet on, but the bullet struck right where the helmet didn't quite cover, leaving a painful bruise and a lingering ache. If you take half a brick and slam it hard on the edge of your helmet, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Believe me, it will be a painful experience.
The clash at the Colombian border began when Guaido stated that Venezuela urgently needed American humanitarian aid and organized trucks to deliver supplies across the border.
Juan Guaido was attempting to drive these trucks into Venezuela, determined to push through. Meanwhile, on the other side, people were setting them on fire, causing the situation to spiral out of control. The trucks burned down entirely, leaving behind only charred remains. It was a complete disaster. Then came the most terrifying moment of all, the moment when two crowds, not just the police, but two large, determined crowds of people, surged forward and rushed directly at one another, colliding in a chaotic and dangerous confrontation.
At least 3 people died and over 300 were injured. Since then, the clashes on the bridges have never stopped.
Maduro's people organized and brought loyal supporters from various regions to bolster public demonstrations. These were activists, but loyal to Maduro in a different range of ages. Many were older individuals, but there were also younger people, some even just children, who were fiercely committed to defending Maduro's cause, even if it meant putting their lives on the line. These individuals are very real, and their presence cannot be ignored. They are willing to go to any lengths, even extreme measures, to prevent any form of change.
Just a few hundred meters from the military base, on the day the trucks tried to break through the barricade, a group of men gathered, communists and socialists alike. They all fervently supported Maduro's government. Yes, those people are here too. Mostly they're from the poor and struggling population, grateful to receive any assistance for free.
You see, that's exactly the point. The reality that these individuals are impoverished is not a mere coincidence. Governments that operate in this manner deliberately maintain their populations in a state of poverty because it facilitates easier control. When people are stretched thin, working 2 and in some cases even 3 jobs merely to make ends meet and provide for their families, they lack both the time and the financial resources to pursue anything beyond their immediate survival needs, such as furthering their education or traveling to gain broader perspectives on how others live. I'm not referring simply to taking a holiday in a sunny destination. I'm talking about the opportunity to experience firsthand that life could be different and more fulfilling. It's a kind of financial isolation, where people are denied the chance to take a step forward, trapping them in a cycle of hardship and missed opportunities. To make a significant change, an individual immersed in that environment from a young age must undergo a profound transformation, essentially relearning how to live from scratch. What does this transformation entail? It involves breaking free from the pervasive control over their life, at least mentally. But why do people cling so tightly to the system? Because at some point they completely lost faith in themselves and their abilities. They stopped believing they could achieve more on their own than simply by accepting handouts. People are all different. In any society, you'll find the driven individuals as well as those who are less ambitious. The persistent ones will find a way to push through, no matter the circumstances or challenges they face. Even in North Korea, there are business people who manage to work around the restrictive system, skillfully cutting deals with officials. These are individuals with sharp minds and strong wills who know how to get what they want despite significant obstacles. But most people aren't like that. Most are just ordinary individuals who aspire to live comfortably, raise their children with care and attention, perhaps enjoy reading the newspaper in the quiet of the evening, rather than struggling with multiple jobs while attempting to achieve extraordinary feats. They simply desire a stable, fulfilling, and decent life. That doesn't mean they don't deserve a good life, just like the ones who hustle and push relentlessly. I think the crucial difference between governments is exactly this: how the second group of people lives, the ones who don't push for more at any cost, but seek stability and contentment. If the majority are enduring these harsh conditions, it clearly indicates the government is systematically exploiting them for its own purposes. It doesn't want people to become smarter or wealthier. Why would Maduro want such progress? If people come to realize that life can be significantly better, they might start demanding meaningful change, and some could even join the opposition. So he'll keep them perpetually at the edge of survival, preventing any real improvement. Just enough so they don't develop. I think the real test of a government is how it treats the people who aren't pushing through the cracks, especially the elderly. That's precisely why I always say the pensioners are the true face of any country. Here's what I personally think. If your pensioners and those not climbing the ladder are working 2 or 3 jobs just to feed their families, then you're simply exploiting them. You're getting rich, comfortably sitting on your vast oil reserves while they struggle to survive, fall deeper into poverty, and face ever-increasing hardships. Governments exist to restore balance. They're supposed to help those who lack the same tenacity or resources as those who've made it to the top, whether it's oil rigs or speculative profits, ensuring opportunities for everyone to creating a more equitable future. Look at the type of person who ends up in these schemes. They need to have a specific set of skills. They've got to be exceptionally smart, cunning, fearless, and highly manipulative, often navigating complex social dynamics and high-stakes situations. There aren't many people like that, but they'll succeed anywhere they go with their unique talents. But why do you bother with elections? Why seek votes from people who lack those qualities and can't break through on their own without such exceptional skills? For what? Because they believe and hope that things will change, even though they can't afford to invest in education or travel to see how others live and critically assess their own circumstances. They remain trapped in a cycle where the status quo continues to dominate, preventing any meaningful progress. And that's really scary. It seems to me in a society like that, there's no real room for progress. Thanks for tuning in, friends. This has been Lyadov. If you like this format, please share your thoughts in the comments. I read all your feedback and will consider your suggestions for future topics and videos. Thanks again.